Hello everyone, it's Kathy here, and today I'm going to share with you how to create a card using some basic supplies that you might have around the house. So for this card you will need some watercolor paints, watercolor paper, some paint brushes and some blank cards, and I've got a blank black card by Kaisercraft, and this particular card measures 10.7 by 15.2 centimeters. And for this card I like to have a little border, and the border that I'm going to have is about 10.2 by 14.9, which is about half a centimeter from the top edge and the side edge, which is about 4 inches by 5 7/8 of an inch. And I like to create templates because it helps me to visualize the actual front of the card. So what I'm doing is just tracing this onto the watercolor paper and then marking it out. So you can cut this out with scissors, but I have a paper trimmer, so I'm going to use that. It helps me to save paper, and it also helps me to work out the plan of what I'm going to do for my card design. So if you don't have a card that measures the same as what I'm using, just use those simple measurements and just subtract half a centimeter from the top and also from the side, and you can see that you can create a border as well. To prepare the watercolor paper, I've got a old clipboard and my watercolor paper, and I'm just attaching it with some painter's tape. The watercolor paper that I'm using has got a rough side and a smooth side, so I'm making sure that my smooth side is facing up. And with the tape I'm just leaving a small border on the edge as I prep it and place it onto my surface. And this is going to prevent warping when we add water and the watercolor paints onto this board, and it's also going to help move it around to dry. I've got some washi tape here, and I got this from Officeworks, and it's quite thin. What I'm going to be doing is cutting some this painter's tape rather, into strips, and I'm just using a craft knife and a ruler to do this. I'm also going to be using that washi tape as well later on. So I'm just moving the strips up, just getting ready, because what I'll be doing is I'm going to be using the tape and taping it onto the watercolor paper to create a design. And you'll see me just ripping and just randomly putting the strips on to create a design that's going to help prepare the overall pattern. And what I'm doing is I'm just placing the tape to create different sized shapes, and I'm trying not to have big areas that are dominating the watercolor paper. So I'm moving the tape around until I feel I've got a nice design with shapes that I feel are cohesive. And I'm using the washi tape now because I've run out of painter's tape. Now I'm ready to start painting. So off camera I've got 2 containers, one with clean water and one that I'm using to rinse my brush in. And what I'm doing is I'm laying some clear water inside those prepared areas, and I'm just using the watercolor paints, and I'm letting the watercolor paints just drip, and I'm using 2 colors in each section, and I'm letting the watercolor paints mix together. But I'm being careful not to oversaturate the areas, because otherwise it's going to bleed underneath the tape. So I put clear water first, and then I'm adding 2 different colored watercolor paints into each of those sections. And I'm not being too careful with what colors I'm using, but I'm trying to have different colors, as you can imagine, that are complementary to each other in each section. So I'll just demonstrate once more, just adding the clear water and then dabbing it through with the second color. And as you can see, I've nearly finished here, just letting the watercolor paints drip and letting the water do its magic. So not too much water so that it bleeds underneath that tape. So what I'm going to be doing next is I'm going to allow this to dry, and then I'm going to be working on the next part of the design, and I'll be using some more watercolor paper, and we're going to create a heart. So I've got an old cutting board, and I've taped the watercolor paper down to this board, and I've just applied a lot of water. And I forgot that I had this other paint palette, and this is Crayola watercolor paints. And what I'm doing is the same sort of thing. I'm just dabbing the watercolors and letting it drip into each other, and I've just using different tones of reds and oranges and letting them run into each other so that they mix. And I'm just dabbing it around and letting the water mix it in. Everything's dry now, so now I'm just peeling off the tape, and the trick to this is to start backwards. So I'm looking at how I've put the tape down and to peel things diagonally, and that's going to minimize tearing and avoid tearing of the watercolor paper. I have to admit my paper did tear just a little bit, but it wasn't anything too drastic. So if you tear on a diagonal and rip it off that way, you'll be fine. For this, I do have some templates, but you can actually draw a heart and cut it out. I'm going to stamp a sentiment, and if you don't have stamps, that's fine. You could probably print something out on your computer, or if you want to, you could handwrite something. But I've got these stamps, and I wanted to use a hashtag stamp set that I've got, and you can see that I've got the sentiment believe, because I think that's very uplifting at the moment. And so I'm just using a black ink, and I'm going to use my Misty stamping tool to help me get a good impression of my stamp. And I'm using some scrap white cardstock, and I'm again just going to trim it on my paper trimmer just so that it leaves a nice edge around it. You can use scissors for this if you wish. Next is the construction of all the pieces, and what I'm using is just some craft glue, and I'm just going to put a generous amount because it is thick paper, this watercolor paper, and I'm going to position that onto the card front. And one thing that's good about craft glue is you do have a little bit of wiggle room, just so that you can make sure that you do have an even border around the outside of the card, which is what I'm doing at the moment. I'm going to place the heart in the middle, and I've got some foam squares that I'm going to use just to give it some dimension, and I'm just peeling that adhesive off just so I can attach that to the front. If you don't have this particular adhesive, you could use glue, or if you've got some cardboard, you could attach that and then glue that to the back of your heart and then to your card for dimension. Next, I'm going to use some more of those foam squares to attach my sentiment to the front of my card, and that also gives it a bit of dimension and makes it stand out as well. Again, if you don't have that, craft glue would be just fine, or if you want to handwrite it onto your heart, that would be fine as well. So this is the final step in the completion of this card. So I hope you enjoyed creating this card. I think it looks really effective. So thanks so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day, and I hope you enjoy creating cards using watercolor paints.